Hello and welcome everyone back again. We are going to recap today a Korean movie called Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring 2003. The film begins with an overview of the site of a Buddhist monastery in South Korea, and the Buddhist monastery is located in the middle of a beautiful pond, and the only way to reach it is by boat, even though there are no walls. The pool is entered through only two large doors. The season is spring, and we can now see the pool is open. Then we see an old monk prays in front of a Buddhist statue inside a monastery. He completes his prayer and wakes up his student from his sleep. Then, the young disciple wakes up and goes directly to the prayer area. Then, he completes his prayer and goes out there. Then, the monk got into the boat and went to beg for food in the boat. And the student went to collect herbs from the forest. And, while he was collecting herbs, the disciple reaches a large Buddha statue. Then, he looks at the landscape and sees nothing but their monastery in the pond. Then they met at the big door, and they boarded a boat and they arrived at the monastery. Then, the monk helps the child distinguish the edible plants from the poisonous ones. Then, the child sometimes got out of the landscape. He has a dog as a pet, and he plays with the dog before he goes to the bed. Next, the boy was playing in the forest. Then, he caught a fish and tied a stone around it, then dropped it into the water and laughed, and the fish cannot swim. The old monk watches him from afar away, but decides not to interfere with the child while he is having fun. Then he caught a frog and tied it to a stone and laughed at it. Once again, he is amused by the fact that the frog cannot move properly. Then, he finds a snake and tortures it in the same way. And the old monk looks at him silently, but waits for the right opportunity. Then, the monk decides to return and take a large stone with him. He went to the monastery and saw the sleeping child and tied a large rock behind the child. To wake up, the boy immediately wakes up and asks the monk to release him. But the monk tells the boy that he did the same torture to the fish and the snake, and that he deserves it. The boy obeys his master and gets into the boat with a stone on his back. He found the fish, but it was already dead. He buried it and screamed. Then he found the frog. Fortunately, it was still alive, so he released it and went to find the snake. But unfortunately, the snake also died. He starts to cry for what happened. Then, the hunt has come, and the pool doors were opened again. After some years, the student is now an adult. He goes to the mountains to collect some herbs where he sees a snake, and he feels the need to run. He comes to tickle his body, but he ignores it and moves on. Then he saw two women climbing the mountain. The mother came to see the elderly monk because her daughter was sick. The disciple greets the women and takes them to the convent in the monastery to meet the monk. Then, the old monk explains to the mother that her daughter's soul is suffering. If the daughter's soul is calm, her body is also healthy. Then, the daughter stays in the monastery to receive treatment, and the mother leaves. And, while the girl was changing her clothes, he accidentally opened the door and saw her without a shirt. Then, he closed the door in fear and left. In the afternoon, he entered the monastery and saw the girl sleeping. He thought it was cold and decided to cover the girl with a blanket. Then, he couldn't control himself, touching the girl's chest. Then, the girl blasphemes him and hits him. Then, the disciple realized his mistake and began to apologize to the Buddha statue. Then, we see that the pupil now has a chicken as a pet. Then, one day the disciple took the girl in a boat and was very attracted to her body. Then, he raised her body again and started touching her face. He slowly moved his hand to the girl's chest, but the girl pushed him away. The next day, he witnessed the monk and his student bringing the girl a drink. The student gives the girl a drink to drink, and the treatment continues, and she feels better now. One day, the student was rowing the boat and saw the girl staring at him. Then, he sensed her signals and put her in the boat, and she happily went with him. Finally, the girl's students bring the girl a drink. Finally, she saw the two fall in love. After some flat games, they rest for a while on the mountain and then return to the monastery. Then, the old monk is sleeping, and the girl invites the disciple to sleep with her. One day, they both go to the boat in the middle of the night, and after having a relationship, they sleep in the boat. Then, the pupil who opens the matter and begins explaining to his master. He understands his actions in apologizing to his master, but the monk understands his actions and tells him that they are normal. Then he asked the girl if she was okay, and she said yes. Then, the old monk told her to go now, and the old monk himself was going to take her to the village. But when they were about to leave, the disciple lost control and asked the teacher to let her stay in the piri. But the teacher rejects his request and explains that the desire arouses the lust, and that this ultimately leads to misery. Then, the monk leaves the girl in the village and returns later. Then, the monk was asleep in the afternoon, but the disciple has lost the girl. Then, he wraps the Buddha statue in a bag and decides to leave the monastery because he intends to see the girl outside. Then, here, the monk monk is awake actually, but he decided not to prevent his student from doing so. Then, the schoolboy leaves his chicken in the boat, then he releases the chicken into the forest, and then he goes to find the girl. Then, time passes and we see that autumn has come, and the old monk still lives alone and has now a cat as a pet. Then, one day he returned from the village with his food, and that the food was wrapped in the newspaper. And while eating, he noticed an article in the newspaper. The article is talking about a man who runs away after killing his cheating wife, and it turned to be that the man in the newspaper is a student of the monk, and the monk sits down to read it. Then, after that, the monk begins making clothes for his student because he knows he'll be back any minute. And the monk's prophecy has already been fulfilled. The desire for love had prompted a spontaneous love, then made the student to commit murder. Then we see the student returning to the monastery where he grows up with the real anger and despair. Then, the monk takes him on a boat and they return to the monastery, and the monk asks him about his life. Then, he cried that his only sin was to love and that he had killed his wife because she had cheated on him. Then, later he brought the student back and the Buddhist statue was back to where it was. Then, the next morning the monk was sleeping peacefully while the student was angry and could not sleep during the day. Then, he holds his breath and attempts to commit suicide in front of a Buddhist statue. The monk heard his cough and opened the door to examine him and to see what is happening. The monk became an angry man, sees his student trying to commit suicide, and then he hits him with a stick. Then, he tied him with a rope and hang him. Then, the disciple suffers and the old monk writes some phrases on the ground with his cat's tail. Then, the student finishes his sentence and cuts his hair with the same knife he used to kill his wife. Then, he comes out and sees a spell written on the floor of the beer. Then, the old monk tells him to slit every letter of the mantra with a knife and tells him that his anger will slowly subside. Then, the pupil obeys his orders and begins to work. But as soon as the gate opened and two people called out to the old monk, they are both actually police officers and they went to there to arrest the student. Then, the monk goes to bring them to the monastery. The police wants to arrest the student, but the old monk asks them to let him finish his work first. And, out of respect for the ancient monk culture and Buddhism, the police agreed to wait until the next day. The disciple continues chanting the mantra and does not stop even when blood drips from his hands while he is working. And the police officer was watching him all the time to make sure he does not escape. And he does not go to sleep until after his work is finished. The next morning, the old monk woke up and began filling the statues with colors. Even the cops helped the monk fill the colors. Then the disciple woke up, and as the old monk said, his anger and despair completely disappeared, and now he feels happy and calm. The disciple bows before his master and goes with the two policemen. Then, the three of them got into the boat to go, but the boat does not move. It only moves when it shakes hands with its men. So, the old monk says goodbye. Then it moves. Now the monk's disciple went again, and this time he was sad and started planning something. He puts more in the boat and reduces his possessions in the monastery. Then he lights a fire with wood. Then he sits on it and he ends his life. It is a Buddhist custom to end your life as you wish if you have truly achieved your purpose in life. And while the wood is burning, the old monk is crying. This indicates that he could not escape the pleasures of life. Then, a burning fire and a snake passing by the boat. This is an indication that a new life cycle for the monk has begun. Then, years passed, and the doors of the pool opened again, and the season was winter and fire. And the student returned after completing his sentence in prison. He went inside the monastery and found a snake sitting in his master's robe. The snake represents a rebirth for Buddhism in an attempt to honor its master. Then, he collects his master's ashes and places them inside a Buddha statue. The next day, he makes a hole in the pool. Then, he washes his face with the pool water, and then he goes to examine his master's books. And then, he resumes his training in another way, ways mentioned in the books, and days go by. Then one woman appears with an invisible face and a crying child in her hand at the gates of the pond. The disciple received her, and he prayed in front of a Buddha statue. At midnight, she left the child in the monastery and decided to run away. But while she was leaving, she accidentally stepped on the hole made by the student, and she fell into the water and died instantly. Then, he blames himself for leaving the hole open and decides to follow his master's principles to punish himself. He tied a heavy stone around his waist, and he took a Buddha statue with him, and he began his journey towards the mountain. Then, he realizes how the frogfish and the snake felt. Then, after hours of climbing, he reached the top of the mountain and placed the statue on it. Then, Then, he meditates there for a while and catches a glimpse of the beautiful view this time, instead of just seeing the monastery. He can see far away, which indicates that his vision and life have grown significantly. And at the end, we see the gates of the pool open again. In the spring, now the student is the teacher and the child left by the women is his student. This time they have a turtle as a pet, and the child plays with it too. The little disciple was just like his master, as he could be seen torturing a frog and an eel, just like his master did before while he was a child. Does this indicate that man's destiny has been decided and that he will always suffer before he finds the right path? This is the question of the movie. The end.